What would you do if you woke up after what felt like a normal night's sleep, only to discover that 7 days had passed and you had no memory of any of it? Park Ranger Marlee went to bed on Tuesday night in the Great Smoky Mountains. But when she opened her eyes, the calendar showed the following Tuesday. Security footage showed her leaving the station that first night, but she never returned on camera. Yet somehow she was back in her bed. The most disturbing part was finding a handwritten note in her jacket pocket, written in her own handwriting. Don't trust the lights in the burial ground. They're not what you think they are. Tonight on Vera, we're sharing 11 terrifying stories from park rangers who've experienced things that will haunt your dreams. Subscribe and hit that notification bell because you won't want to miss these bone-chilling encounters. There are some places in this world where the very ground beneath your feet seems to have a mind of its own. And Olympic National Park's Hoh River Valley is one of them. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago. But I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about that trail that shouldn't exist. My name is Carter. I've been a park ranger for 8 years now, stationed primarily in the temperate rainforest section of Olympic National Park in Washington State. I live in a small cabin about 15 minutes outside of Forks, the same town made famous by those vampire movies. Though what I encountered in these woods was far more terrifying than any fictional creature. I'm a methodical person by nature. I keep detailed logs, I follow protocols to the letter, and I pride myself on being able to explain almost anything that happens in my section of the park. That's what makes this story so difficult for me to tell. It started on a foggy Tuesday morning in late October. The Hoh River Valley was experiencing its typical autumn weather, dense fog rolling in from the Pacific, temperatures hovering around 45 degrees, and that constant mist that makes everything look like it's wrapped in gauze. I'd been assigned to investigate reports from 3 separate hiking groups over the past week, all claiming they'd gotten lost on the Hoh River Trail despite using GPS devices and official park maps. The Hoh River Trail is one of our most popular and well-maintained paths. It's an 18-mile trail that follows the Hoh River through old-growth rainforest to Blue Glacier on Mount Olympus. I've hiked it hundreds of times. I could walk it blindfolded. The trail markers are clear, the path is obvious, and there's really no way to get seriously lost if you stay on the designated route. Yet 3 different groups had called for rescue after finding themselves in completely unfamiliar terrain, despite swearing they never left the main trail. The first group was a family from Portland. The Johnsons, experienced hikers who'd done this trail twice before. They insisted they'd followed every trail marker perfectly, but somehow ended up in a dense grove of western red cedar trees near what appeared to be an unnamed creek, about 4 miles off course from where they should have been. When our rescue team found them, they were genuinely confused and kept insisting they'd never seen the terrain they were in before, even though they were still technically within park boundaries. The second incident involved 2 college students from Seattle who claimed they'd hiked for 6 hours on what they thought was the main trail, only to find themselves at a scenic overlook that doesn't exist on any park map. They described a vista looking out over a valley filled with perfectly straight rows of massive Douglas fir trees, like someone had planted a forest in geometric patterns. When they tried to retrace their steps, they couldn't find the overlook again and ended up back at the trailhead, having lost nearly 8 hours. The third group was what really got my attention. An elderly couple, the Hendersons, both retired geography teachers who'd been hiking for over 30 years. They'd started at the Hoh River Trailhead at 8 a.m. with full packs, planning to camp at Elk Lake. At 3 p.m., they called for help from what they described as a wrong forest. When I asked what they meant, Mrs. Henderson said the trees were different instead of the massive Sitka spruces and western hemlocks characteristic of our rainforest. They found themselves surrounded by what looked like ponderosa pines and Rocky Mountain junipers, trees that don't grow anywhere near the Olympic Peninsula. I decided to investigate personally. On that foggy Tuesday morning, I packed my standard gear, GPS unit, radio, emergency supplies, camera, and my detailed topographical maps. I started at the Hoh River trailhead at 7 a.m., following the exact route described by all three groups. For the first 2 miles, everything was completely normal. The trail wound through the typical old-growth forest, past massive nurse logs covered in moss and ferns, with the sound of the Hoh River rushing alongside the path. It was at mile marker 2.3 that I first noticed something odd. There was a trail marker I'd never seen before. A standard brown wooden sign with white lettering that read, Cascade Vista, 1.2 miles. I stopped immediately. I'd been working this section of the park for 8 years, and there is no trail called Cascade Vista anywhere in the Hoh River area. I checked my GPS. It showed I was exactly where I should be on the main trail. I radioed back to headquarters to ask about the sign. "Carter, there's no trail by that name in your sector," came the reply from dispatch. "Are you sure you're reading it correctly?" I described the sign in detail. The response was silence. Then, "Carter, I'm looking at the maintenance logs. No new signs have been installed in your area in over 2 years." I took photographs of the sign and the surrounding area. The sign looked official, weathered in a way that suggested it had been there for years. The trail it indicated branched off to the right, heading uphill through a stand of moss-covered big-leaf maples. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow it. The trail was well-maintained, about 4 feet wide with clear sight lines. It didn't appear on my GPS as anything other than unmarked terrain, but it was definitely a constructed path. As I climbed, the forest began to change. The typical rainforest understory of sword ferns and Oregon grape gave way to plants I didn't recognize. Low shrubs with silvery leaves and small white flowers that had no business growing in this climate. After hiking for exactly 1.2 miles, according to my GPS, I reached what the sign had promised, a scenic vista. But this wasn't any overlook I'd ever seen in Olympic National Park. I was standing on a rocky outcrop looking down into a valley that stretched for miles, filled with what appeared to be perfectly cultivated rows of identical evergreen trees. The trees were planted in such precise lines that they created geometric patterns visible from my vantage point. In the distance, I could see what looked like a large wooden structure, almost like a barn or warehouse, sitting in the middle of the tree farm. I checked my GPS again. According to the device, I was standing in the middle of a dense forest with no clearings for miles in any direction. But my eyes were clearly showing me an expansive valley vista that didn't match any topographical map of the area. I took dozens of photographs and recorded GPS coordinates. When I tried to call the sighting in to headquarters, my radio produced only static. My cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in the deep forest. But my GPS was still functioning perfectly, still showing my location as dense woodland. I spent another hour at the overlook, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The sun was starting to break through the morning fog, and in the clearer light, I could see movement around the wooden structure in the valley. What looked like vehicles, though they were too far away to identify clearly. When I finally decided to head back, I carefully marked the trail junction and began retracing my steps. But after hiking downhill for what felt like the correct amount of time, I found myself back at the Hoh River Trail. Not at the junction where I'd turned off, but at mile marker 1.8, about half a mile before where the Cascade Vista sign should have been. I hiked back up the trail, looking for the sign in the junction. Mile marker 2.0, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. No sign. I continued to mile marker 2.5, then 3.0. The Cascade Vista trail was simply gone. I spent the rest of the day searching the area, checking every possible side trail and deer path. Nothing. When I returned to headquarters that evening, I immediately downloaded the photos from my camera. The images of the trail sign and the vista were crystal clear, showing exactly what I'd seen. But when I checked the GPS coordinates I'd recorded, they placed the overlook in the middle of what our satellite imagery showed as unbroken forest canopy. Over the next 3 weeks, I returned to that section of trails 6 more times, always with different equipment and sometimes with other rangers. We never found the Cascade Vista sign or trail again. But something else started happening. The reports of lost hikers stopped. Completely. No more confused families. No more geology teachers finding themselves in wrong forests. I've never been able to explain what happened that day. The photographs exist. The GPS coordinates are recorded in my official report, but the trail itself has never reappeared. Sometimes I wonder if I somehow prevented other people from experiencing what I did. Or if the trail was waiting for someone like me, someone methodical enough to document it properly, before it disappeared forever. What I know for certain is that there are places in our national parks where the normal rules don't seem to apply, where trails can exist one day and vanish the next, where the landscape itself seems to have intentions we can't understand. The Hoh River Valley still looks exactly the same as it always has. But now, when I patrol that area, I can't shake the feeling that the forest is watching me, waiting to see if I'll try to find that trail again. I never have. There are sounds in this world that your brain simply refuses to process. Sounds so alien and wrong that every survival instinct you've developed over millions of years of evolution screams at you to run. What I heard in the thermal basins of Yellowstone at exactly midnight on September 15th was one of those sounds, and it still haunts me 3 years later. My name is Daniela. I've been a park ranger at Yellowstone National Park for 12 years now, and I live in a small apartment in West Yellowstone, Montana, right outside the park's west entrance. I specialize in the geothermal features of the park, the hot springs, geysers, and thermal pools that make Yellowstone unique. I have a degree in geology from Montana State University, and I've spent more time around bubbling mud pots and sulfur vents than most people spend in their own backyards. I thought I knew everything there was to know about the thermal areas until that night proved me completely wrong. The Norris Geyser Basin is the hottest and most dynamic thermal area in Yellowstone, with underground temperatures reaching over 400 degrees Fahrenheit. It's located in the northwest section of the park, about 12 miles south of Mammoth Hot Springs, and it's where I conduct most of my research and monitoring work. The basin is divided into 2 sections, the Porcelain Basin and the Back Basin, connected by a network of boardwalks that keep visitors safely away from the scalding thermal features. I'd been assigned to investigate reports of unusual seismic activity in the Back Basin area. For 3 weeks running, our monitoring equipment had been picking up micro tremors that occurred at exactly midnight, every single night. The tremors weren't strong enough to be felt by humans, but they were consistent enough to be concerning. Dr. Peterson, our chief geologist, wanted someone to spend a few nights in the area with portable monitoring equipment to see if we could pinpoint the source. The Back Basin is about 1.5 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking trail during the day or by special permit for research purposes at night. It's an eerie place, even during daylight hours. Dozens of hot springs and fumaroles scattered across a landscape that looks more like an alien planet than anywhere on Earth. The ground is stained yellow and orange from sulfur deposits. Steam rises constantly from cracks in the earth, and the air smells like rotten eggs from hydrogen sulfide gas. On the night of September 15th, I hiked into the back basin around 10 p.m., carrying my portable seismograph, temperature monitoring equipment, and camping gear. The plan was to set up my instruments near Steamboat Geyser, the world's tallest active geyser, and monitor the area through the midnight window when the tremors typically occurred. Steamboat Geyser is unpredictable. It can go months or even years without erupting, then suddenly shoot water over 300 feet into the air with no warning. The area around it is constantly changing as new thermal features appear and old ones fade away. That night, the geyser was in a quiet phase, with only minor steam vents and the occasional small water eruption from its numerous side vents. I set up my equipment about 50 yards from the main vent, close enough to get good readings, but far enough away to be safe if Steamboat decided to have a major eruption. The night was clear and cold, probably around 35 degrees, which made the contrast with the thermal features even more dramatic. Steam was rising everywhere, creating an otherworldly landscape of shifting white clouds illuminated by my headlamp. At 11:45 p.m., I started getting readings that made no sense. The temperature probes I'd placed in several thermal pools began showing rapid fluctuations. Temperatures dropping from their normal 90 degrees Fahrenheit down to normal groundwater temperatures of around 50 degrees, then spiking back up within minutes. I'd never seen thermal features behave like this before. Then, at exactly 11:58 p.m., something happened that I still can't fully explain. Every single thermal feature in the visible area, every hot spring, every fumarole, every steam vent, went completely silent. In 12 years of working around geothermal areas, I'd never experienced total thermal silence. There's always something bubbling, always steam escaping, always the constant background hiss and gurgle of superheated water moving underground. But for 2 minutes, from 11:58 to midnight exactly, the entire back basin fell silent. Not just quiet, completely, unnaturally silent. No steam, no bubbling, no geological sounds at all. Even the wind seemed to stop. The only sound was my own heartbeat, which was getting faster as I realized I was witnessing something that shouldn't be possible. Then, at exactly midnight, it started. The sound began deep underground, so low in frequency that I felt it in my chest before I actually heard it. It was like a massive pipe organ playing a note far below the range of human hearing, but somehow I could still perceive it. The sound built slowly, rising in pitch and volume, until it became an otherworldly howl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I've heard wolves howl, I've heard elk bugle, I've heard every sound that wildlife in Yellowstone can make. This was none of those things. This sound was mechanical and organic at the same time, like machinery trying to imitate a living creature, or a living creature that had become part of a machine. It rose and fell in a pattern that almost seemed like language, like something was trying to communicate in a frequency that human ears were never meant to process. As the howling continued, every thermal feature in the basin suddenly roared back to life simultaneously. Geysers that had been dormant started erupting. Hot springs began boiling violently, and new steam vents opened in the ground around me. The temperature readings on my equipment went completely chaotic. Some probes showing readings over 400 degrees, others showing temperatures below freezing, all at the same time. But the most terrifying part wasn't the sound itself or the thermal chaos. it was what the sound did to the local wildlife. Within seconds of the howling starting, I could hear every animal in the area fleeing. Not just moving away quietly, but running in absolute panic. Elk crashing through the forest, smaller animals racing through the underbrush. And in the distance, the sound of an entire bison herd stampeding away from the thermal basin. I grabbed my radio to call for backup, but all I got was static mixed with that same impossible howling sound, as if whatever was making the noise was somehow interfering with radio frequencies. My GPS unit started displaying coordinates that placed me in different locations every few seconds, jumping between points that were sometimes hundreds of miles apart. The howling lasted for exactly 13 minutes, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The thermal features gradually returned to their normal activity levels, and the electronic interference cleared up. When I checked my seismograph, it showed that during those 13 minutes, micro tremors had been occurring not just in the back basin, but radiating outward in a perfect circle with a radius of approximately 12 miles. I packed up my equipment immediately and hiked out, calling for backup as soon as I had radio contact. When the response team arrived an hour later, they found something that I still can't explain. Every thermal pool in the back basin had changed temperature to exactly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, human body temperature. They stayed at that exact temperature for 6 hours before gradually returning to their normal ranges. The official report classified the incident as unusual seismic activity with unknown causation. The temperature anomaly was documented but never explained. The audio recording I made of the howling was analyzed by acoustic experts who concluded that the sound contained frequencies both above and below the normal range of human hearing, and that it displayed mathematical patterns suggesting artificial generation. What we never reported officially was what happened in the weeks following that night. The midnight tremors stopped completely. The wildlife patterns in the area changed permanently. Animals that used to frequent the thermal areas now avoid them entirely. And 3 times since then, hikers have reported hearing distant howling sounds coming from underground in various thermal areas throughout the park, always at exactly midnight. I still work in the thermal basins of Yellowstone, but I've never volunteered for overnight monitoring duty again. There are some things in this park that exist beyond our understanding of geology and natural processes. Whatever lives in the superheated depths beneath Yellowstone's thermal features, it made itself known that night. And I have the distinct feeling it was studying me just as much as I was trying to study it. The sound still visits me in my dreams sometimes. That impossible howling that seemed to come from the earth itself. And every time I hear it, even in sleep, every instinct I have tells me the same thing it told me that night in the back basin. Some sounds are warnings, and some warnings should be heeded. Time is supposed to be the one constant in our lives, the thing we can always count on to move forward in a predictable, measurable way. But what happens when a week of your life simply vanishes, leaving behind only fragmented evidence that you did things you can't remember doing? My name is Marley. I'm 26 years old, and I've been working as a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 3 years now. I live in a small rental house in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, about 20 minutes from my duty station at the Elkmont Historic District. I've always been the type of person who keeps detailed records. I write everything down in my daily logs. I take photos of unusual incidents, and I maintain a personal journal that I've kept since college. That's what makes what happened to me in October so absolutely terrifying. Because according to my own documentation, I lived through a week that I have absolutely no memory of. The Great Smoky Mountains span the border between Tennessee and North Carolina. and my assigned area covers some of the most remote sections of the Tennessee side. The park is famous for its biodiversity, its historic cabins, and unfortunately, its history of mysterious disappearances. What most visitors don't know is that the Smokies have a long tradition of unexplained phenomena, dating back to Cherokee legends about places where the spirit world intersects with our own. My patrol area includes the Elkmont section, which contains the largest collection of log cabins and historic buildings in the park. Many of these structures date back to the early 1900s, when Elkmont was a logging town and later a summer resort community. The area has a haunted quality even during the day. Weathered cabins sitting empty in clearings, surrounded by forest that's slowly reclaiming what was once a bustling community. On Tuesday, October 8th, I started what I thought would be a routine day. I remember every detail of that morning clearly. I woke up at 6:15 a.m., made coffee, and checked the weather forecast. Partly cloudy with temperatures in the mid-60s. I drove to the ranger station, checked in with my supervisor, and reviewed reports of strange lights that several hikers had reported seeing near the Cherokee burial grounds in the Oconaluftee area the previous weekend. The burial grounds are located about 8 miles from Elkmont, in a section of the park that's technically open to hikers, but rarely visited because the trails are poorly marked and the terrain is challenging. According to Cherokee oral history, the area has been a sacred burial site for over 1,000 years. Park policy requires us to investigate any unusual activity near these culturally sensitive areas, both to protect the sites and to ensure visitor safety. I remember driving out to the trailhead around 10 a.m., parking my ranger vehicle, and hiking the 3-mile trail to the burial grounds. The area is marked by ancient stone cairns and a few weathered wooden signs asking visitors to respect the sacred nature of the site. What I found there was unusual, but not alarming. Several areas where the ground appeared to have been recently disturbed, as if someone had been digging, and strange burn marks on some of the trees that formed almost geometric patterns. I took photographs, collected GPS coordinates, and made detailed notes in my field journal. The last entry I wrote was at 2:47 p.m. Unusual markings on trees appear to be made by some kind of intense heat source. No evidence of campfires or other obvious causes. Recommend follow-up investigation with Cultural Resources Team. That's the last thing I remember from what I thought was Tuesday, October 8th. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in my own bed, sunlight streaming through my bedroom window. I felt groggy and disoriented, like I was coming out of the deepest sleep of my life. I checked my phone for the time, 7:23 a.m. But when I looked at the date, my blood went cold. According to my phone, it was Tuesday, October 15th. A full week had passed. I immediately called in sick and spent the day trying to piece together what had happened. My house showed clear signs that I'd been living there normally. Dirty dishes in the sink, laundry in the hamper, my bed unmade in a way that suggested I'd been sleeping in it regularly. My car had 127 additional miles on the odometer. My phone showed that I'd made several calls and sent text messages, but I had no memory of any of them. The most disturbing discovery came when I checked my work schedule. According to the ranger station logs, I had reported for duty every single day of that missing week. I had filed daily reports, conducted routine patrols, and even attended a staff meeting on Friday the 11th. My supervisor, when I carefully questioned her, confirmed that I had seemed completely normal throughout the week. But I had no memory of any of it. I drove out to the Cherokee burial grounds, hoping that returning to the last place I remembered might trigger some memories. What I found there made my hands shake. The site had been completely transformed. The areas of disturbed ground I had photographed were now filled in and covered with natural-looking vegetation, as if the digging had happened months ago rather than a week. The burn marks on the trees were gone. But the trees themselves showed new growth patterns that looked like they'd been growing that way for years. Most unsettling of all, there was a new stone cairn in the center of the burial ground, built from rocks that perfectly matched the ancient ones, but was clearly recent construction. Arranged around the base of the cairn were small objects that looked like offerings: polished stones, dried wildflowers, and what appeared to be small, carved wooden figures. When I got home that evening, I found a handwritten note in my jacket pocket, written in my own handwriting. Don't trust the lights in the burial ground. They're not what you think they are. The old ones are trying to protect something that should stay buried. Stop looking, or they'll make you forget permanently next time. I had no memory of writing that note. Over the following days, I tried everything I could think of to recover my missing memories. I visited my doctor, who found no evidence of head trauma or medical issues that could explain memory loss. I retraced my steps according to my work logs and GPS data from my phone, visiting every location I had apparently been during that lost week. I found evidence of my presence everywhere. My footprints in mud that hadn't dried yet. Equipment I had apparently used and left in specific locations, and even a half-eaten sandwich in my patrol vehicle that was still fresh. The security footage from the ranger station showed me arriving and leaving work normally each day, but there was something subtly wrong about the recordings. I moved differently, my posture was straighter, and I seemed to be looking around constantly, as if I was seeing the familiar workplace for the first time. In one clip from Thursday afternoon, I could be seen standing perfectly still in the parking lot for over 10 minutes, just staring at the forest, not moving at all. The most chilling discovery came when I reviewed the official reports I had apparently filed during the missing week. Each daily log was written in my handwriting and contained accurate information about routine park activities. But buried in the middle of Wednesday's report was a single line that I never would have written. Recommend avoiding Okonalufti burial grounds area until further notice. Site requires cultural consultation regarding protective measures. I never filed that recommendation through official channels. But somehow, it had been entered into the park's database, and the burial grounds area had been temporarily closed to visitors. When I checked with my supervisor, she had no memory of receiving that recommendation from me. 3 months have passed since my missing week, and I still have no memory of those 7 days. I've continued working as a ranger, but I avoid the Cherokee burial grounds area. The official closure remains in effect, supposedly due to ongoing cultural resource evaluation, though no one seems to know who ordered the evaluation or when it might be completed. Sometimes I dream about lights dancing through the forest, leading me deeper into areas of the park I've never seen before. In these dreams, I'm following the lights willingly, even though a voice in my head is warning me not to trust them. I always wake up before I reach whatever destination the lights are leading me toward. I've learned to check my calendar obsessively, constantly, because I never want to lose another week of my life without knowing it. But sometimes, when I'm patrolling the more remote areas of the Smokies, I catch glimpses of strange lights flickering just at the edge of my vision. When that happens, I turn around immediately and head back to more populated areas. Whatever happened to me during those 7 missing days, whatever I saw or did or agreed to, I'm certain of one thing. The lights in the Cherokee burial grounds aren't just natural phenomena. There's something much older and more purposeful than that. And they have the power to make people forget things that perhaps should be forgotten. I just hope I never find out what those things are. There's nothing quite like finding your own name spelled out in animal bones to make you realize that someone has been watching you far longer than you ever imagined. What started as random bone arrangements scattered throughout my patrol area became a terrifying game of cat and mouse that nearly cost me my sanity. My name is Virginia. I'm 42 years old, and I've been a park ranger at Death Valley National Park for 15 years. I live alone in a small house in Beatty, Nevada, about an hour's drive from the park's headquarters in Furnace Creek. Death Valley is the hottest, driest, and lowest place in North America. And it's where I've spent the better part of my adult life learning to navigate some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. I'm not easily rattled. You can't be and survive out here. But what happened to me over the course of 6 months last year tested every ounce of courage and stubbornness I've built up over my career. Death Valley National Park covers over 3 million acres of desert wilderness, stretching across the California-Nevada border. My patrol area includes some of the most remote sections of the park, the Panamint Mountains, the racetrack playa, and the isolated canyons that most visitors never see. It's a landscape that looks like another planet, with salt flats that stretch to the horizon, mountains that rise abruptly from the desert floor, and temperatures that regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer. The area around the racetrack playa is particularly desolate. The racetrack is a dry lake bed famous for its sailing stones, large rocks that mysteriously move across the flat desert floor, leaving long trails behind them. It's located about 27 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a rough dirt track that destroys most vehicles that aren't built for serious off-road travel. During my patrols, a hoster, I might go days without seeing another human being. It was during one of these routine patrols in March that I first encountered what I would later come to think of as my stalker's calling cards. I was checking on the racetrack area after winter storms had passed through, documenting any damage to the access road or interpretive signs. About halfway between the parking area and the playa itself, I found something that stopped me cold. Arranged in a perfect circle, about 6 feet in diameter, were the bones of what appeared to be several different desert animals. Coyote skulls, snake vertebrae, birdwing bones, and what looked like the ribs of a bighorn sheep. The bones were bleached white by the sun and appeared to have been placed there recently, despite the fact that I had driven this exact route just 2 weeks earlier and seen nothing unusual. What made the arrangement particularly unsettling was how deliberate it looked. This wasn't the random scattering you'd expect from predator kills or natural deaths. Each bone was positioned with obvious care, creating geometric patterns within the circle that almost looked like symbols or letters. I photographed everything, collected GPS coordinates, and filed a report noting unusual animal remains, possibly indicating poaching activity. Over the next month, I found 3 more bone arrangements in different parts of my patrol area. Each one was more complex than the last, and each one was located in a spot where I was guaranteed to find it during my regular rounds. The second arrangement was near Ubehebe Crater, formed into what looked distinctly like an arrow pointing toward a narrow canyon I rarely had reason to explore. The third was at the Mesquite Flat Sand Dunes, arranged in a spiral pattern that incorporated what must have been hundreds of small bone fragments. By the time I found the fourth arrangement, I was beginning to realize that someone was deliberately placing these displays for me to discover. This one was located at Badwater Basin, the lowest point in North America at 282 feet below sea level. The bones were arranged to spell out a single word: watch. That's when I knew I was being stalked. I immediately contacted park law enforcement and began varying my patrol routes and schedules. But whoever was doing this seemed to know my movements better than I knew them myself. No matter where I went or when I changed my routine, the bone arrangements continued to appear, always in locations where I would inevitably find them. The messages became increasingly personal. At Zabriskie Point, I found bones arranged to spell Virginia. Near the Devil's Golf Course, The arrangement spelled 15 years, exactly how long I'd been working at Death Valley. At Artist's Palette, the bones formed what looked like a crude map of my patrol area, with X marks at specific locations. The most disturbing discovery came in late May, during the hottest part of the year when few visitors venture into the deep desert areas. I was conducting a maintenance check on a remote weather monitoring station near Telescope Peak when I found an arrangement that made my blood run cold despite the 115-degree temperature. The bones spelled out my home address in Beatty. I called for backup immediately, but by the time other rangers arrived, we found something that defied explanation. The bone arrangement was still there, but it had been modified. Someone had added fresh bones, so fresh they still had tissue attached, arranged to spell out a new message. Home alone? The implication was clear. Whoever was doing this knew where I lived, knew my work schedule, and had been watching me closely enough to know my personal habits. I requested immediate leave and spent the next week staying with my sister in Las Vegas while park law enforcement conducted an investigation. When I returned, the bone arrangements had stopped. For 3 weeks, I patrolled my usual areas without finding a single unusual bone display. I began to think that maybe the increased law enforcement presence had scared off my stalker, or that they had moved on to harassing someone else. I was wrong. The arrangements resumed in June, but now they were different. Instead of spelling out words or creating geometric patterns, the bones were arranged to depict scenes, crude but unmistakable illustrations of a person being watched. One arrangement showed a stick figure surrounded by animal skulls with empty eye sockets all facing inward. Another showed what looked like a person sleeping, with bone fragments arranged around them like a fence. But the most terrifying discovery came on a blazing hot Tuesday in late June. I was investigating reports of vandalism at the Harmony Borax Works, a historic site in the central part of the valley. When I arrived, I found bones arranged in a perfect replica of my house. The layout was unmistakable. Down to the position of the front door, the windows, and even the small shed in my backyard. Inside the bone house, positioned where my bedroom would be, was a small pile of what I initially thought were more animal bones. But when I looked closer, I realized they were carved wooden figures, crude, humanoid shapes that had been painted to look like people. One of them was clearly meant to represent me, complete with a miniature ranger hat carved from wood. That's when I noticed the fresh tire tracks leading away from the site. Tracks that were still sharp and clear in the sand despite the constant wind. I followed them for about a quarter mile before they reached the paved road and disappeared. But as I was walking back to my vehicle, I found one more thing that sent me into a full panic. Fresh boot prints in the sand around my patrol truck. Someone had been examining my vehicle while I was investigating the bone house, walking around it multiple times, and based on the depth and clarity of the prints, they had done so within the last few minutes. I was being watched at that very moment. I got in my truck and called for immediate backup, then drove straight back to headquarters without conducting the rest of my patrol. That afternoon, park law enforcement found a campsite hidden in a narrow canyon about 2 miles from the Harmony Borax Works. The camp contained dozens of photographs of me taken during my patrols over several months, detailed maps of my routes with times and dates noted, and a journal filled with observations about my habits and schedule. But they never found the person who had been living there. I transferred to a different section of the park and moved to a new house with a security system. The bone arrangement stopped appearing, and I never found any more evidence of being stalked. But I never felt safe in the remote areas again. Even now, 3 years later, I catch myself constantly checking my rearview mirror and looking over my shoulder when I'm out on patrol. Death Valley is a place where you can disappear completely, where the landscape itself can hide secrets for decades. Somewhere out there, in those endless canyons and hidden valleys, someone spent months watching me, learning my patterns and creating elaborate displays designed to terrorize me. They knew things about my life that they should never have been able to know, and they had access to areas of the park that should have been impossible to reach undetected. I never found out who it was or why they chose me. But I learned something important about working alone in isolated places. You're never as alone as you think you are. And sometimes the thing watching you from the shadows knows more about you than you know about yourself. Some sounds become so familiar that your brain stops registering them as unusual. Which is why it took me 3 weeks to realize that something was knocking on my cabin door every single night at exactly 3:17 a.m. What made it truly terrifying wasn't the knocking itself, but the fact that whatever was doing it never left any trace of having been there. My name is Catalea. I'm 31 years old, and I've been working as a research ranger in Everglades National Park for 6 years. I live in a remote research cabin located deep in the 10,000 Islands area of the park, about 40 miles from the nearest paved road and accessible only by airboat or a treacherous network of narrow waterways that wind through sawgrass marshes and mangrove swamps. The cabin was built in the 1960s for wildlife researchers studying the park's ecosystem, and I'm often the only human being within a 20-mile radius. The Everglades is unlike anywhere else on Earth. A vast river of grass that flows almost imperceptibly from Lake Okeechobee to Florida Bay. My research area covers roughly 200 square miles of the most pristine and isolated wetland wilderness left in North America. The landscape is simultaneously beautiful and alien. With endless sawgrass prairies broken up by hardwood hammocks, cypress swamps, and dense mangrove forests that form impenetrable walls along the waterways. My cabin sits on a small hammock, a raised island of land barely 3 feet above the surrounding water level. It's surrounded by towering royal palms, strangler figs, and gumbo limbo trees whose red bark peels away in papery sheets. During the day, the area teems with wildlife. Alligators sunning themselves on mud banks, wading birds fishing in the shallows, and manatees surfacing in the deeper channels. At night, it becomes a different world entirely, filled with sounds that would terrify anyone not familiar with the Everglades nocturnal symphony. I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in the park's bird populations, and my research requires me to maintain detailed logs of nesting behavior, migration patterns, and population changes. The work demands long hours in the field and even longer hours back at the cabin, analyzing data and updating databases. The isolation never bothered me. In fact, I preferred it to the crowded research stations closer to civilization. The knocking started in late August, during the peak of the wet season when afternoon thunderstorms dump inches of rain in a matter of hours, and the humidity makes every breath feel like swimming through soup. I first noticed it on a Tuesday night while I was updating my field notes on a laptop computer powered by solar batteries and a small generator. At exactly 3:17 a.m., I heard 3 distinct knocks on the front door of my cabin. Not urgent or frantic, but deliberate and evenly spaced, like someone politely requesting entry. I assumed it was a park ranger or researcher who had gotten lost navigating the waterways at night. Something that happened occasionally despite GPS technology. When I opened the door, my flashlight beam revealed nothing but the familiar sight of my small dock extending into the dark water, Spanish moss hanging from the oak trees, and the red eyes of an alligator reflecting light from about 30 yards away. I called out, thinking whoever had knocked might have stepped away from the door, but got no response except for the normal chorus of frogs, insects, and the occasional splash of something large moving through the water. I walked around the entire perimeter of my small island, checking for any sign of a boat or person, but found nothing unusual. The next night, I was ready. At 3:15 a.m., I positioned myself by the front window with my flashlight and camera, determined to catch whoever was playing what I assumed was some kind of prank. At exactly 3:17 a.m., I heard the same 3 knocks, deliberate, evenly spaced, and coming unmistakably from the front door. I immediately opened the door and shined my flashlight in all directions. Nothing. No person, no boat, no disturbance in the water or vegetation that would indicate someone had just been there. I took dozens of photographs of the area around my cabin, hoping to catch some evidence I might have missed with my naked eye. When I reviewed the photos the next morning, I found something that made me question my own senses. In several of the images, there were clear ripples in the water leading away from my dock, as if something large had just moved through the water moments before I took the pictures. But I had seen and heard nothing entering or leaving the water. The knocking continued every single night for the next 3 weeks. Always at exactly 3:17 a.m., always the same 3 deliberate knocks. I tried everything I could think of to catch my mysterious visitor in the act. I set up motion-activated cameras around the cabin. I stayed awake all night watching from different vantage points. And I even spent one night sitting on the front porch with a spotlight ready to illuminate the area the moment I heard the knocks. Nothing worked. The knocks came regardless of whether I was watching or not. But I never saw anything that could have made them. The pattern began to change in early September. The 3 knocks became 5, then 7, then a complex sequence that seemed almost rhythmic, like someone tapping out a code. The sounds also became more aggressive. Instead of polite knocking, I began hearing what sounded like scratching, as if something with claws was trying to dig through the wooden door. That's when I started finding the evidence. Each morning after a night of scratching sounds, I would find fresh gouges in the wood around my door frame. The scratches were deep and appeared to be made by something with multiple sharp claws, but they didn't match any animal I was familiar with in the Everglades. They were too large and too deep to be made by a raccoon or armadillo, but the pattern wasn't consistent with alligator claws either. More disturbing were the footprints I started finding in the mud around my cabin. They appeared to be humanoid, but wrong in subtle ways. Too long, with what looked like webbing between the toes, and impressions that suggested whatever made them had been walking partially upright, but was equally comfortable moving on all 4s. The sounds escalated again in late September. Instead of knocking or scratching, I began hearing what can only be described as someone or something trying to turn the door handle. The old brass knob would creak and rattle as invisible hands worked at it, testing to see if the door was locked. I had installed multiple deadbolts after the scratching started, but hearing something systematically testing each lock sent chills down my spine. One night in early October, the sounds moved beyond the front door. I was lying awake in my small bedroom, listening to the familiar rattling of the door handle, when I heard footsteps on the roof above my head. Whatever was visiting me had apparently climbed onto the cabin and was walking back and forth across the metal roofing, its footsteps creating a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed designed to let me know it was there. The footsteps moved from the roof to the walls of the cabin. I could hear scratching sounds as something moved around the outside of the building, testing windows, probing for weaknesses. Several times, I heard what sounded like breathing right outside my bedroom window, separated from me by nothing but a thin pane of glass and a flimsy screen. I called for backup, but the nearest park rangers were hours away by airboat, and radio communication in the deep Everglades is unreliable at best. I was completely on my own with whatever was circling my cabin like a predator testing the defenses of its prey. The final confrontation came on October 15th. During a night when a tropical storm was passing offshore, bringing with it torrential rain and winds strong enough to bend the palm trees nearly horizontal. The storm should have masked any sounds from outside, but at exactly 3:17 a.m., I heard something that cut through the noise of the wind and rain like a knife. Something was inside my cabin. I heard footsteps in the main room, slow and deliberate, accompanied by a wet, dragging sound as if whatever had entered was leaving a trail of swamp water behind it. I grabbed the shotgun I kept for protection against alligators and slowly opened my bedroom door. Standing in my living area, with its back turned toward me, was a figure I still can't adequately describe. It was roughly human in shape, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, with arms that hung nearly to the floor and skin that appeared to be covered in a combination of scales and moss. Water dripped constantly from its body, forming puddles on my wooden floor, and it moved with an unsettling fluid grace that suggested it was equally at home in water and on land. The thing turned toward me, and I found myself looking into eyes that reflected light like an alligator's, but held an intelligence that was disturbingly human. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. And then it simply walked out my front door, which I distinctly remembered locking before going to bed. I never saw it again, but I didn't stay to find out if it would return. I requested a transfer the next day and moved to a research station closer to civilization. The official report stated that I was relocating due to personal safety concerns related to wildlife encounters, which was technically true. I still work in the Everglades, but I never venture into the deep wilderness alone anymore, and I never stay overnight in remote locations. Because somewhere in those endless sawgrass marshes and mangrove swamps, something that shouldn't exist continues to visit empty cabins at exactly 3:17 a.m., testing doors and windows, looking for someone who might be foolish enough to let it inside. There are some places on Earth where sound behaves in ways that defy every law of physics you thought you understood. And Carlsbad Caverns has chambers so deep that voices from the past somehow find their way back to the present. What I heard echoing through those limestone corridors should have been impossible, but the recording equipment doesn't lie. My name is Halo. I'm 29 years old, and I've been working as a cave specialist at Carlsbad Caverns National Park in New Mexico for 9 years. I live in the small town of Carlsbad, about 25 miles northeast of the caverns, in a modest apartment that I chose specifically because it has no basement. After what happened to me in the depths of those caves, I can't handle being underground unless it's absolutely necessary for work. Carlsbad Caverns is one of the most extensive cave systems in North America, with over 119 known caves formed by sulfuric acid dissolution in limestone bedrock. The main cavern that tourists visit is just a tiny fraction of the total system. There are miles of unmapped passages, vertical shafts that drop hundreds of feet into darkness, and chambers so vast that our most powerful lights can't reach the walls or ceiling. My job involves maintaining the trail systems in the tourist areas, monitoring air quality and geological stability, and most importantly, exploring and mapping the undeveloped sections of the cave system. I have specialized training in technical rope work, cave rescue, and underground navigation. I'm comfortable in environments that would send most people into claustrophobic panic attacks, and I've spent more time hundreds of feet underground than I have in my own apartment. The incident I'm about to describe happened in late November, during the slow season when tourist visitation drops off and we have more opportunity to work in the undeveloped areas. I was part of a team surveying a section of the cave system known as the Lower Cave. specifically a series of chambers and passages that extend more than 800 feet below the main tourist route. The lower cave is accessible only through a narrow entrance called the King's Palace Elevator Shaft, followed by a challenging descent through a series of tight passages that require specialized equipment and techniques. The area I was mapping that day was called the Echo Chamber, a room roughly the size of a football field with a domed ceiling that rises over 100 feet above the floor. The Echo Chamber gets its name from its remarkable acoustic properties. Due to the shape of the room and the composition of the limestone walls, sounds behave in unusual ways. A whisper spoken at one end of the chamber can be clearly heard at the opposite end, while normal conversation in the center of the room creates complex reverberation patterns that can make it difficult to determine where voices are coming from. I was working alone that day, which violates standard cave safety protocols, but I was only supposed to be checking equipment and taking measurements in an area I'd been to dozens of times before. My task was to verify GPS coordinates for some new survey markers and test the audio equipment we used to monitor bat populations in the deeper caves. At around 2:30 p.m., I was calibrating a sensitive microphone array in the center of the echo chamber when I heard something that made me stop what I was doing immediately. Through my headphones, which were connected to the microphone system, I could hear voices having a conversation somewhere in the chamber. This shouldn't have been possible. I was alone in a section of the cave system that was closed to tourists and other staff members. The nearest person was over half a mile away and several hundred feet above me, but the voices were clear and distinct, close enough that I could make out individual words. Two people were having what sounded like an argument about getting lost. A man's voice was saying something about taking the wrong passage, while a woman's voice insisted they should have turned left at the last junction. They sounded stressed and frightened, which wasn't unusual for people who had gotten separated from tour groups. But their presence in this restricted area was a serious safety concern. I called out to them, identifying myself as a park ranger and asking them to respond so I could locate them and guide them back to safety. My voice echoed through the chamber in the usual complex patterns, but I got no response from the lost visitors. I spent the next hour systematically searching every passage and alcove in the echo chamber, calling out regularly and listening for responses. The chamber has several side passages that lead to smaller rooms and dead-end galleries, and I checked each one thoroughly. I found no sign that anyone else had been in the area recently. No footprints in the soft cave sediment, no disturbance of the delicate cave formations, nothing. But through my headphones, I could still hear the voices. The conversation continued intermittently for the entire time I was searching. The man and woman seemed to be moving through areas of the cave system that I couldn't access, discussing landmarks and formations that sounded familiar, but weren't in any location I could identify. At one point, the woman mentioned seeing the room with the crystal formations that look like flowers, which sounded like she was describing the Crystal Spring Dome, a chamber located about a quarter mile from where I was working. I made my way to Crystal Spring Dome, a journey that required climbing through several narrow passages and rappelling down a 40-foot shaft. The entire time, I could hear the voices in my headphones, sometimes closer, sometimes more distant, but always clear enough to understand. When I reached Crystal Spring Dome, I found it empty, just as I expected. But something was wrong with the audio I was receiving. The voices were describing the chamber I was standing in with perfect accuracy, mentioning specific formations and features that could only be observed by someone who was actually there. They talked about the flowstone cascade that looks like a frozen waterfall, and the cluster of soda straws hanging from the ceiling near the east wall, both accurate descriptions of unique features in that exact chamber. But I was alone. I decided to record everything I was hearing and reviewed the audio when I returned to the surface. What I found on those recordings has never been adequately explained by anyone who's heard them. The voices were crystal clear, with no background noise or interference that might suggest they were coming from radio transmissions or electronic equipment malfunction. More disturbing was what happened when I researched the content of the conversations I had recorded. The lost visitors were discussing specific cave features and using terminology that matched incident reports from the 1970s and 1980s. They mentioned formations that had been damaged or altered by decades of natural cave processes, describing them as they had appeared years or even decades earlier. The breakthrough came when I played the recordings for Jake, one of the veteran cave guides who had been working at Carlsbad since the 1970s. He immediately recognized the voices as belonging to Tom and Sarah Mitchell, a married couple from Texas who had gotten separated from a tour group in March 1983 and were never found. The Mitchells had been part of a special wild cave tour that took experienced cavers into undeveloped areas of the cave system. During the expedition, they had somehow become separated from the main group in an area known as the Boneyard, a complex maze of passages about half a mile from where I had been working. Despite an extensive search and rescue operation that lasted for over a week, no trace of them was ever found. The recordings I made contained conversations between Tom and Sarah Mitchell, discussing their attempts to find their way back to the main tour route and their growing fear as they realized they were lost in an unmapped section of the cave system. The conversations I heard were taking place in real time, as if they were still down there, still trying to find their way out of passages they had entered over 30 years ago. I've returned to the echo chamber several times since then, always with proper backup and safety protocols. And I've never heard the voices again. The microphone equipment functions normally, picking up only the expected sounds of dripping water, air movement, and the occasional bat activity. But I've learned something about Carlsbad Caverns that isn't in any of the geological surveys or tourist brochures. In certain chambers, under specific acoustic conditions, the limestone walls seem to preserve sounds from the past and play them back like some kind of natural recording device. The echo chamber doesn't just create echoes of sounds happening now. It somehow holds onto voices from decades ago and releases them when conditions are exactly right. Somewhere in the unmapped depths of Carlsbad Caverns, Tom and Sarah Mitchell are still trying to find their way home, still having the same conversations they had in March 1983, still moving through passages that exist in some strange acoustic memory preserved in limestone walls that have been listening to human voices for over a century. I still work in the caves, but I never go into the echo chamber alone anymore. And I always carry backup audio equipment to verify what I'm hearing. Because in a place where sound can travel through rock and time in ways we don't understand, you can never be sure whether the voices you're hearing are coming from the present or the past. There's a special kind of paranoia that comes from realizing someone has been documenting every step you take, every breath you breathe, and every decision you make without you ever knowing they were there. In the ancient redwood groves of Northern California, I discovered that being watched by an unknown intelligence is far more terrifying than any encounter with wild animals could ever be. My name is Nadia. I'm 34 years old, and I've been working as a park ranger in Redwood National and State Parks for 4 years. I live in Crescent City, California, a small coastal town about 20 minutes from the entrance to some of the most magnificent forest wilderness left in America. The redwood groves are my cathedral, my sanctuary, and the place where I thought I understood every sound, every shadow, and every subtle sign that indicates when something is out of place. The park system protects over 139,000 acres of coastal temperate rainforest. including 45% of all remaining old-growth redwood forest. These trees are the tallest living things on Earth, some reaching heights of over 380 feet and ages exceeding 2,000 years. Walking among them feels like moving through a natural cathedral built by time itself, with massive trunks rising like columns to support a canopy so thick that very little sunlight reaches the forest floor. My patrol area includes the Grove of Titans, a remote section of the park that contains some of the largest and most ancient redwoods in existence. Access is restricted and requires a special permit, which means I'm often the only human being in several square miles of pristine wilderness. The grove is located about 8 miles inland from the coast, connected to the main park road by a narrow hiking trail that winds through dense understory vegetation and crosses several small creeks. The Grove of Titans earned its name from the truly massive scale of its trees. Specimens like lost monarch, screaming titans, and stalagmite are among the largest known living organisms on the planet. The forest floor is carpeted with ferns, sorrel, and fallen logs that serve as nurse logs for new generations of redwoods. The atmosphere is always cool and humid, with a perpetual green twilight created by the towering canopy overhead. I first noticed the signs in early June, during what should have been routine maintenance patrols to check trail conditions and monitor for any damage from late spring storms. I found small disturbances in the forest floor that didn't match any known animal behavior. Patches of ferns that had been carefully parted and then returned to their original position, but with a subtle difference in the way they lay that suggested human interference. At first, I assumed the disturbances were caused by permitted researchers or photography groups who had been granted special access to the grove. But when I checked the permit records, I found that no one had been issued access permits for the Grove of Titans in over 6 weeks. I was supposed to be the only person entering the area. The signs became more obvious over the following weeks. I began finding what appeared to be observation posts, carefully constructed blinds made from fallen branches and fern fronds, positioned to provide clear sight lines of the main trail and the most frequently visited groves. The construction was sophisticated, using natural materials in ways that made the blinds almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look for them. Each blind was positioned at a location that would allow someone to observe visitors without being detected, and they were all oriented towards spots where people typically stop to photograph the massive trees or rest during their hikes. What disturbed me most was the evidence that these observation posts had been occupied recently. Compressed vegetation where someone had been sitting, and small depressions in the soft earth that looked like they had been made by someone spending hours in the same position. I began documenting everything I found, taking GPS coordinates and photographs of each site. Over the course of 3 weeks, I identified 12 separate observation posts scattered throughout my patrol area, all expertly concealed and strategically positioned. Someone had been conducting systematic surveillance of every visitor to the Grove of Titans, possibly for months. The breakthrough came when I decided to vary my own patrol patterns, arriving at the grove at different times and approaching from unexpected directions. During an early morning patrol in late June, I found something that confirmed my worst suspicions about what was happening in my forest. Hidden beneath a massive fallen log, I discovered a cache of equipment that looked like it belonged to a professional surveillance operation. Waterproof containers held high-powered binoculars, telephoto camera lenses, and what appeared to be listening devices. But most disturbing were the dozens of notebooks filled with detailed observations about park visitors. The notebooks contained meticulous records going back over 8 months, documenting the behavior patterns of everyone who had visited the grove. Each entry included physical descriptions, arrival and departure times, equipment carried, and detailed notes about conversations and activities. The handwriting was neat and systematic, suggesting someone with military or law enforcement training. But what truly horrified me were the entries about my own patrol activities. Page after page contained detailed observations about my daily routines, my preferred routes through the forest, and personal information about my life that no stranger should have known. The observer had recorded which trees I stopped to examine, where I ate my lunch, and even private phone conversations I had made during my patrols. One entry from 2 weeks earlier read, "Subject N arrives, 08407. Follows standard route to Lost Monarch. Spends 12 minutes examining trail damage from recent storms. Calls supervisor at 0932 to report fallen branch blocking North Trail access. Lunch consumed at usual location near Screaming Titans at 12:15. Exhibits nervous behavior, frequently looks over shoulder, maybe developing awareness of observation." I was being studied like a laboratory specimen. I immediately contacted park law enforcement and arranged for backup, but whoever had been conducting the surveillance was clearly skilled at remaining undetected. When we returned to collect the equipment cache the next day, it was gone. The notebooks, cameras, and listening devices had vanished without a trace, and the hiding place had been cleaned so thoroughly that we found no forensic evidence of what had been there. But the observation posts remained active. During subsequent patrols, I continued to find evidence of recent occupation. Fresh disturbances in the vegetation, new sight lines cleared through the understory, and the unmistakable sense of being watched that every ranger learns to trust. The most unnerving discovery came during a night patrol in early July. I was investigating reports of unauthorized camping when I found an observation post that was still occupied. Using night vision equipment, I could see a human figure positioned in a carefully constructed blind about 60 yards from the main trail, apparently watching a small group of permitted researchers who were conducting a late evening photography session. I called for backup and attempted to approach the position, but by the time additional rangers arrived, the watcher had vanished. We found evidence of rapid departure. Equipment hastily abandoned, vegetation disturbed in a way that suggested someone had fled in a hurry. But we never saw the person responsible, and despite bringing in tracking dogs, we couldn't determine which direction they had gone. The surveillance activities stopped abruptly after that night, but I never felt secure in the grove again. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential observer. Every rustle of vegetation made me wonder if someone was documenting my reaction to it. The ancient redwoods that had always felt like protective guardians began to feel like silent witnesses to activities I couldn't understand or control. I requested a transfer to a different section of the park system and now work in areas with higher visitor traffic and better cell phone coverage. The official report stated that the Grove of Titans had been subject to unauthorized research activity by unknown individuals and recommended increased security patrols, but no arrests were ever made. I still think about those notebooks sometimes, wondering what kind of person spends months in the wilderness conducting systematic surveillance of random park visitors. What were they looking for? What kind of research requires that level of detailed observation of people who just wanted to experience the majesty of the world's tallest trees? The redwood groves continue to attract visitors from around the world. People seeking connection with these ancient living monuments. But somewhere among those massive trees, someone may still be watching, still taking notes, still documenting the behavior of every person who enters their domain. And the most terrifying part is that you'll never know they're there unless they want you to. The trees themselves keep their secrets, standing as silent witnesses to whatever purposes drive someone to spend their life hidden in the shadows of giants, watching and waiting and recording everything they see. There are natural laws that we take for granted. Gravity pulls things down, water freezes at 32 degrees, and temperature changes gradually across geographic areas. But what happens when you discover a place where these laws don't apply? Where you can step from deadly heat into bone-chilling cold within the span of a single footstep. My name is Anya. I'm 38 years old, and I've been working as a backcountry ranger in Glacier National Park for 11 years. I live in a small cabin in West Glacier, Montana, about 15 minutes from park headquarters. And I've spent more time in high alpine wilderness than most people spend in their own neighborhoods. I'm trained in wilderness first aid, technical rescue operations, and cold weather survival, skills that I never thought would be tested in ways that defied every principle of physics I thought I understood. Glacier National Park encompasses over 1 million acres of pristine wilderness along the Continental Divide in northwestern Montana, bordering both Canada and the Flathead National Forest. My patrol area includes some of the most remote and challenging terrain in the park: high-altitude cirques, glacial valleys, and mountain passes that are accessible only to experienced hikers with proper equipment and training. The area where this incident occurred is called the Ptarmigan Wall, a series of steep rocky ridges and narrow valleys located about 12 miles from the nearest trailhead. It's terrain that challenges even experienced mountaineers, with elevations ranging from 6,000 to over 9,000 feet, unpredictable weather patterns, and glacial features that can change dramatically from season to season. The Ptarmigan Wall region is known for its extreme microclimate variations. In a single day, hikers might experience blazing sunshine on exposed ridges, sudden snowstorms in high passes, and temperatures that can swing 40 degrees within a few hours. But what I encountered there in late August went far beyond normal weather patterns and entered the realm of something that shouldn't exist in the natural world. I was investigating reports from 3 separate hiking parties who claimed to have experienced impossible weather conditions in the same general area over the past 2 weeks. The first report came from a group of experienced mountaineers from Colorado who insisted they had encountered a wall of cold air that dropped temperatures from 70 degrees to near freezing within a distance of less than 10 feet. They described walking through what felt like an invisible barrier that separated normal late summer conditions from winter-like cold. The second report was even more bizarre. A family from Seattle claimed they had been hiking in comfortable 60-degree weather when they suddenly found themselves in an area where the temperature was so hot they could barely breathe. They described air temperatures that felt like they were over 100 degrees, despite being at an elevation of over 8,000 feet, where such temperatures should be impossible. The third report came from a solo hiker, an experienced wilderness guide who had been hiking in Glacier for over 20 years. He claimed to have encountered an area where temperatures fluctuated wildly and unpredictably, hot enough to cause heat exhaustion one moment, cold enough to cause hypothermia the next, with changes occurring so rapidly that he barely had time to adjust his clothing before the conditions shifted again. All 3 reports described incidents occurring in roughly the same location: a narrow valley between 2 ridges, about half a mile south of Ptarmigan Lake. The area was accessible only by a challenging off-trail route that required technical climbing skills and took most of a day to reach from the nearest established trail. I decided to investigate personally, planning a 2-day solo patrol with full cold weather gear, emergency communication equipment, and multiple thermometers to document any temperature anomalies I might encounter. I started my hike at dawn on August 28th, following the established trail to Ptarmigan Lake before striking out cross-country toward the reported location. The approach to the area required climbing over a steep saddle between 2 peaks, then descending into a narrow valley that was almost completely enclosed by vertical rock walls. The valley was perhaps 200 yards long and 50 yards wide at its widest point. with a small stream running down its center and patches of alpine meadows scattered among boulder fields. As I descended into the valley, the first thing I noticed was the complete absence of wildlife. In 11 years of backcountry work, I had never encountered an area so devoid of animal life. No birds, no ground squirrels, no insects, nothing. Even the stream, which should have contained native trout, appeared lifeless. The temperature readings on my equipment were normal as I entered the valley, about 62 degrees Fahrenheit, typical for that elevation and time of day. But as I moved toward the center of the valley, following the stream, I began to notice subtle changes in the air around me. At first, it was just a slight warming sensation on my left side, while my right side remained comfortable. I checked my thermometer and found it still reading 62 degrees. But my body was clearly experiencing different temperatures on different sides. I took several steps to the left and immediately felt like I had walked into a furnace. The air temperature on the left side of the valley was so hot, it was difficult to breathe. My thermometer read 118 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature that should be impossible at 8,200 feet elevation. The heat was dry and intense, like standing in front of an industrial oven. And within seconds, I was sweating profusely despite wearing lightweight hiking clothes. I moved back toward the center of the valley, and the temperature immediately returned to normal. But when I took several steps to the right, toward the opposite wall of the valley, I encountered the opposite extreme. The right side of the valley was gripped by bitter cold that penetrated through my clothing, like I had stepped into a walk-in freezer. My thermometer read 23 degrees Fahrenheit, and I could see my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Within minutes, I was shivering uncontrollably, and my fingers were becoming numb despite my insulated gloves. I spent the next hour systematically mapping the temperature zones within the valley, and what I discovered defied every principle of meteorology and physics I had ever learned. The valley was divided into distinct temperature zones that remained constant and clearly defined, as if invisible walls separated areas of different climate. The left side of the valley maintained temperatures between 110 and 125 degrees Fahrenheit along its entire length. The right side remained between 15 and 25 degrees. The center corridor, following the stream, maintained normal seasonal temperatures. But most disturbing were the transition zones between these areas. Boundaries where temperature changed by over 90 degrees within the span of a single step. I could stand with my left foot in blazing heat and my right foot in freezing cold, experiencing both extremes simultaneously. The boundaries were so sharp and well-defined that I could determine their exact location by slowly moving my hand back and forth, until I found the point where temperature changed instantly. As I continued my investigation, I realized that the temperature zones were not static. Over the course of several hours, I watched the boundaries shift and move, sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly. Areas that had been scorching hot in the morning became frigid by afternoon, and vice versa. The changes seemed to follow no predictable pattern. The most terrifying moment came when I was taking detailed measurements near the center of the valley and suddenly found myself surrounded by extreme heat on all sides. What had been a safe corridor of normal temperature became a furnace that threatened to cause heat stroke within minutes. I had to run blindly through the superheated air, hoping to find a cooler zone before I collapsed from hyperthermia. I escaped the heat zone and found myself in an area of normal temperature. But the experience left me shaken and dehydrated. I realized that the temperature anomalies weren't just unusual weather. They were dangerous enough to kill anyone who became trapped in the wrong zone for too long. I documented everything I could with photographs, GPS coordinates, and detailed temperature readings, then left the valley as quickly as possible. The return hike felt like fleeing from something that wanted to consume me. and I didn't feel safe until I was miles away from that narrow valley. When I reported my findings, the response was immediate and concerning. Within a week, the area was quietly closed to public access, with signs warning of hazardous conditions. No official explanation was ever given, and when I asked about follow-up research or investigation, I was told that the matter was being handled by appropriate specialists. I never returned to the Ptarmigan Wall region, and I've never heard any official explanation for what I experienced there. But I've learned that there are places in our national parks where the natural world operates according to rules we don't understand, where the very air around you can become a weapon that alternates between burning and freezing. Somewhere in the high country of Glacier National Park, that valley still exists, with its impossible temperature zones that shift and change like some kind of natural trap waiting for unwary hikers. And I suspect that whatever forces created those conditions are still active, still dangerous, and still completely beyond our ability to explain or control. Some places don't just take your photographs or souvenirs when you leave. They take pieces of your mind, erasing memories so fundamental that you forget who you are and why those missing pieces ever mattered. What I discovered in the narrow slot canyons of Zion was something that feeds on human memory, leaving its victims with gaps in their lives they'll never even know existed. My name is Madeline. I'm 36 years old, and I've been working as a backcountry ranger in Zion National Park for 7 years. I live in Springdale, Utah, a small gateway town just outside the park entrance, in a house that I chose specifically because it has a clear view of the towering red sandstone cliffs that define this incredible landscape. I've always been fascinated by the psychological effects of wilderness experiences on people, which is what made the pattern I discovered so deeply disturbing. Zion National Park encompasses 229 square miles of dramatic desert wilderness in southwestern Utah, characterized by massive sandstone cliffs, narrow slot canyons, and the Virgin River that carved this spectacular landscape over millions of years. The park's most famous features are its slot canyons, narrow passages between towering rock walls that create an otherworldly environment of reflected light and sculpted stone. My patrol area includes some of the most remote and challenging slot canyons in the park, particularly the technical routes that require permits and advanced hiking skills to access safely. These canyons can be dangerous places. Flash floods can turn them into death traps within minutes, and their narrow confines can cause severe claustrophobia even in experienced hikers. The pattern I noticed started in early September. During the busy fall season, when cooler temperatures bring increased visitation to the desert southwest, I began receiving reports from family members and friends of visitors who had hiked in the slot canyons and returned home with unusual memory problems. The first case involved a retired couple from Denver who had hiked the Narrows, one of our most popular slot canyon routes. 3 days after their return home, the wife called our visitor center to report that her husband couldn't remember their 30th wedding anniversary, which had occurred just 2 months earlier. She said he remembered their wedding day clearly, and he remembered their 29th anniversary celebration, but the 30th anniversary had been completely erased from his memory. The second case was more disturbing. A college student from California had hiked several of the technical slot canyons during a week-long visit to Zion. When she returned to school, she discovered that she couldn't remember her major, despite being a senior just months away from graduation. She remembered choosing the university. She remembered her freshman and sophomore years. But 3 years of specialized coursework in biochemistry had vanished from her mind. Over the following weeks, I documented 12 similar cases. And in each instance, visitors who had spent significant time in the park's slot canyons returned home with specific, targeted memory loss that seemed to focus on important life events, relationships, or acquired skills. The memory gaps weren't random. They appeared to target the most meaningful and emotionally significant memories from each person's life. What made these cases particularly unsettling was that the affected individuals weren't aware they had lost memories until someone else pointed it out to them. They didn't feel like anything was missing. Their sense of personal continuity remained intact, even though crucial pieces of their lives had been erased. I decided to investigate personally, focusing on the most remote and least visited slot canyons in my patrol area. I chose Mystery Canyon, a technical route that requires rappelling equipment and advanced climbing skills to navigate safely. The canyon is rarely visited because of its difficulty, which made it an ideal location to study the phenomenon without interference from other hikers. Mystery Canyon is a narrow slot that cuts deep into the Navajo sandstone, creating a winding passage between walls that rise over 400 feet above the canyon floor. In some sections, the canyon is so narrow that you can touch both walls simultaneously, and the twisted path means that direct sunlight reaches the bottom for only a few minutes each day. I entered the canyon at dawn, carrying full technical equipment and several cameras to document my experience. The descent requires multiple rappels down smooth sandstone walls, and once you're committed to the route, there's no easy way to turn back. The canyon commits you to completing the entire technical sequence, which typically takes 6 to 8 hours for experienced climbers. As I descended deeper into the slot, I began to notice unusual acoustic properties. Sounds behaved strangely in the narrow confines. My voice seemed to be absorbed by the sandstone walls rather than echoing as it should in an enclosed space. More disturbing was the sense that sounds were being reflected back to me with subtle changes, as if something was listening to every word I spoke and repeating it back with slight modifications. About halfway through the canyon, I encountered a section that doesn't appear on any of the published route descriptions. The main canyon split into 2 passages, one continuing the established route and another branching off into an unmarked side canyon that appeared to lead deeper into the rock formation. According to my maps and GPS, the side canyon shouldn't exist, but it was clearly there. A narrow slot that disappeared into darkness, with smooth walls and a sandy floor that showed no signs of recent foot traffic. Against my better judgment as a safety-conscious ranger, I decided to explore this unmapped passage. The side canyon was unlike anything I had encountered in 7 years of slot canyon exploration. The walls seemed to pulse with a subtle rhythm, as if the sandstone itself was breathing. The temperature dropped noticeably as I moved deeper into the passage, and the quality of light became strange and diffuse, making it difficult to judge distances or depths. After about 200 yards, the narrow passage opened into a circular chamber that was perfectly round, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, with walls that rose straight up beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. The chamber felt ancient in a way that went beyond geological time. It felt like a place that had been waiting for something for a very long time. In the center of the chamber was a pool of water so still, it looked like black glass. The water reflected nothing. Not my flashlight beam, not the canyon walls, not even my own face when I looked into it. It was like looking into a void that absorbed light and sound and anything else that came near it. As I circled the pool, trying to understand what I was seeing, I began to experience something that I can only describe as memories that weren't mine. Images flashed through my mind, scenes from other people's lives, moments of joy and love and accomplishment that belonged to strangers. I saw a wedding in a garden, a graduation ceremony, a child taking first steps. All vivid and emotional, but completely foreign to my own experience. Then I realized what I was witnessing. These weren't random visions. They were memories that had been taken from other people, somehow preserved in this impossible chamber deep beneath the sandstone cliffs of Zion. The pool wasn't reflecting physical objects. It was reflecting stolen memories, experiences that had been extracted from the minds of visitors who had found their way into this hidden place. As I stood there, transfixed by the pool of captured memories, I felt something begin to happen to my own mind. Important moments from my life started to feel distant and unclear. I struggled to remember why I had become a park ranger, couldn't recall the faces of my college friends, and found that my childhood was becoming fuzzy and indistinct. I was being harvested. I forced myself to back away from the pool and leave the chamber immediately. The return journey through the side canyon felt like swimming upstream through thick liquid, and I had to focus intensely on maintaining my sense of self and purpose. By the time I reached the main canyon route, I was exhausted and disoriented, but my memories seemed to be intact. I completed the technical canyon route and returned to park headquarters to file my report. But when I tried to document what I had experienced, I found that crucial details were already fading. I could remember the chamber and the pool, but the specific memories I had witnessed were becoming vague and elusive, like dreams that fade upon waking. Over the following weeks, I interviewed family members of the visitors who had reported memory loss, and I discovered a disturbing pattern. In each case, the affected individual had mentioned finding an interesting side passage, or hidden chamber, during their slot canyon hikes. But none of them could provide specific details about what they had found. I've never been able to relocate the side canyon that leads to the memory chamber. Despite multiple return visits to Mystery Canyon with GPS coordinates and detailed notes, the passage simply isn't there anymore. It's as if the canyon itself decides when to reveal its secret, choosing specific individuals for reasons I can't understand. The memory loss cases stopped occurring after my investigation, but I know that somewhere beneath the red cliffs of Zion, that chamber still exists, waiting for the next group of hikers who might stumble into a place where human memories are collected and preserved like specimens in some impossible museum of stolen experiences. I still work in the slot canyons, but I never hike alone anymore. And I always carry detailed written notes about who I am and why I'm there. Because I learned that in some places, the greatest danger isn't falling rocks or flash floods. It's forgetting who you are and never realizing what you've lost. There's something deeply unsettling about finding a campsite that's clearly being used but never occupied by anyone you can see, especially when it resets itself every single night like some kind of supernatural Groundhog Day scenario. What I discovered in Joshua Tree's hidden valleys challenged everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between the living and the dead. My name is Emery. I'm 28 years old, and I've been working as a park ranger at Joshua Tree National Park in California for 5 years. I live in 29 Palms, a small desert town about 10 minutes from the park's north entrance, in a trailer that I chose specifically because it has solar panels and can operate completely off-grid. A necessity I learned after what happened to me in the remote sections of the Mojave Desert. Joshua Tree National Park encompasses 790,000 acres, where the Mojave and Sonoran deserts meet, creating a landscape that seems more like an alien planet than anywhere on Earth. The park is famous for its twisted Joshua trees, massive granite rock formations, and the kind of profound silence that exists only in true wilderness areas. My patrol area covers some of the most remote and rarely visited sections of the park. Places where you can go days without seeing another human being. The area where this incident occurred is called Hidden Valley, though not the popular tourist destination near the main road. This is a different hidden valley, unmarked on most maps, located about 15 miles from the nearest established campground in the backcountry section of the park. It's accessible only by a rough jeep trail that tests the limits of even the most capable four-wheel drive vehicles, followed by a 2-mile hike through terrain that would challenge experienced desert hikers. This particular hidden valley is a natural depression surrounded by towering granite formations, creating a sheltered area about the size of a football field, with a few struggling Joshua trees and scattered barrel cacti. According to park records, it's designated as a primitive camping area that requires special backcountry permits. But it sees maybe a dozen visitors per year due to its remoteness and the difficulty of reaching it. I first discovered the Phantom campsite during a routine patrol in late October, checking on the area after the summer heat had subsided and fall camping season was beginning. I was documenting the condition of the primitive facilities, basically just a fire ring made of stacked rocks and a small area cleared of vegetation, when I found something that shouldn't have been there. A complete campsite was set up in the designated area with a high-quality dome tent, camping chairs arranged around an active campfire, and what appeared to be dinner cooking in a pot suspended over the flames. Steam was rising from the pot, and the fire was burning steadily with fresh logs that couldn't have been more than an hour old. The campsite showed all the signs of current occupation: wet dishes stacked beside a water container, sleeping bags laid out in the tent, and personal belongings scattered around the area in the casual way that suggests people who are comfortable and planning to return. The problem was that I hadn't seen any vehicles on the access road, and there were no hikers registered for backcountry permits in this area for the entire week. I called out, identifying myself as a park ranger and asking the campers to respond so I could check their permits. No answer. I searched the surrounding area thoroughly, thinking the occupants might be exploring the rock formations or had stepped away briefly for privacy. I found no sign of anyone in the area, but the campsite remained exactly as I had found it: active, occupied, and impossible to explain. The food cooking over the fires smelled like some kind of stew or chili, and when I checked the pot, it contained what appeared to be a fully prepared meal, still hot and ready to eat. The sleeping bags in the tent were arranged for 2 people and felt warm to the touch, as if they had recently been occupied. I spent over 2 hours in the area, expecting the campers to return at any moment. As the sun began to set, I finally decided to wait overnight in my patrol vehicle, parked about a quarter-mile away, where I could observe the campsite without being obvious about it. I was certain that whoever had set up the camp would return after dark, and I wanted to verify their permits and ensure they understood the regulations for backcountry camping. Throughout the night, I maintained surveillance of the campsite using binoculars and night vision equipment. The campfire burned steadily all night without anyone adding fuel to it. The tent remained illuminated from within by what appeared to be a battery-powered lantern, and I could occasionally see shadows moving inside, suggesting the presence of at least 2 people. But every time I approached the campsite to make contact with the occupants, I found it empty. The tent would be zipped shut, the fire would be burning unattended, and there would be no sign of the people whose shadows I had clearly observed just minutes earlier from my observation point. The most disturbing discovery came at dawn. As the sun rose over the granite formations, I watched the entire campsite systematically disassemble itself. The tent collapsed and folded itself into a neat bundle. The camping chairs folded and stacked themselves, and the fire extinguished itself as if someone had carefully scattered the coals and covered them with sand. Within 30 minutes, the campsite had completely vanished, leaving behind only the original primitive fire ring and cleared area that had been there when I first arrived. There was no trace that anyone had ever camped in the location. No compressed vegetation, no lingering smell of smoke, no footprints or tire tracks. I returned that evening to find the campsite had reset itself exactly as it had been the day before. Same tent, same camping chairs, same pot of food cooking over the same fire. I took photographs and video documentation, but the images showed only the original empty campsite with no sign of the elaborate camping setup I was observing with my naked eyes. This pattern continued for 6 consecutive nights. Each day at dawn, the phantom campsite would disassemble itself and vanish. Each evening around sunset, it would reconstruct itself in exactly the same configuration, down to the placement of individual camping items and the type of food cooking over the fire. On the 7th night, I decided to stay in the Hidden Valley area instead of observing from a distance. I set up my own camping equipment about 50 yards from the phantom campsite and waited to see what would happen when I maintained a close presence throughout the night. At approximately 2:30 a.m., I was awakened by the sound of quiet conversation coming from the direction of the phantom campsite. 2 voices, a man and a woman, were having what sounded like a normal camping conversation about the stars, the temperature, and their plans for the next day. The voices were clear and distinct, close enough that I should have been able to see the speakers clearly in the light from their campfire. When I looked toward their campsite, I could see the fire burning in the illuminated tent, but no people. The voices continued their conversation for about 20 minutes, discussing hiking routes in the area and expressing appreciation for the solitude and beauty of the desert. Then the voices faded away, and the campsite returned to its usual state of apparent occupation without visible occupants. The next morning, instead of watching the campsite disassemble itself, I approached it while the process was occurring. As I got closer, I began to hear the voices again, the same man and woman, now discussing breaking camp and preparing to leave. They talked about packing their gear, extinguishing the fire, and planning their drive back to Los Angeles. When I reached the edge of the campsite, I called out to them, but received no response. The voices continued their conversation as if I wasn't there, and I realized I was somehow observing an echo or recording of campers who had used this site in the past. But it wasn't just a simple replay. The phantom campers seemed to be aware of current conditions, commenting on the weather and wildlife that matched what I was observing in real time. I later researched the history of backcountry camping in that area and discovered that a couple from Los Angeles had been reported missing while camping in Hidden Valley in November 1987. Marcus and Elena Rodriguez had been experienced desert campers who had obtained proper permits for a week-long backcountry camping trip. Their vehicle was found at the trailhead, but despite extensive search and rescue efforts, no trace of them or their camping equipment was ever found. The descriptions of their camping gear in the missing persons report matched exactly what I had been observing at the phantom campsite. The tent, the camping chairs, even the type of cookware they carried were identical to the setup that appeared and disappeared each day in Hidden Valley. I've returned to that location several times since then, and the phantom campsite continues its nightly cycle of appearance and disappearance. Marcus and Elena Rodriguez are still camping in Hidden Valley, still having the same conversations, still enjoying their desert wilderness experience 37 years after they vanished without a trace. Somewhere in the remote corners of Joshua Tree National Park, the boundary between past and present becomes thin enough that lost souls can continue their interrupted adventures indefinitely, forever camping in a place where time moves in circles rather than forward, and where some people never really leave the wilderness they loved. Sometimes the truth about the place where you've worked your entire career comes to light only on your very last day, revealing secrets so profound that they redefine everything you thought you knew about your life's work. What I discovered in the hidden depths of the Grand Canyon on my final patrol as a park ranger proved that some mysteries are buried so deep that only those who are about to leave the system forever are allowed to uncover them. My name is Renata. I'm 58 years old, and after 20 years of service as a park ranger at Grand Canyon National Park, I officially retired on October 31st of last year. I live in a small house in Tucson, Arizona, just 7 miles from the South Rim entrance to one of the most iconic natural landmarks in the world. For 2 decades, I thought I knew every trail, every overlook, and every hidden corner of this massive canyon system that stretches 277 miles long, up to 18 miles wide, and more than a mile deep in places. The Grand Canyon is carved by the Colorado River through layers of rock that tell the story of nearly 2 billion years of Earth's geological history. The South Rim, where I spent most of my career, attracts over 5 million visitors annually. But the canyon system contains thousands of square miles of wilderness that most people never see. The North Rim, the inner canyon trails, and the remote backcountry areas are worlds unto themselves, accessible only to experienced hikers and researchers willing to undertake challenging multi-day expeditions. My specialty throughout my career was search and rescue operations, and I had participated in hundreds of missions to locate missing hikers, injured climbers, and lost tourists who had underestimated the canyon's dangers. I knew the statistics by heart. The Grand Canyon sees approximately 400 search and rescue operations each year, with about a dozen fatalities annually from falls, heat exhaustion, and other wilderness-related causes. But there were always cases that didn't fit the normal patterns. Missing persons who vanished without a trace despite extensive search efforts. Bodies that were never recovered despite clear evidence of where accidents had occurred. Equipment and personal belongings found in locations that made no sense given the last known movements of their owners. On my final day of active duty, my supervisor handed me an unusual assignment. Instead of conducting routine patrols or visitor services, I was asked to accompany a special research team to an area of the canyon I had never visited in 20 years of service. The location was identified only by GPS coordinates that placed it somewhere in the remote sections of the North Rim backcountry, accessible only by helicopter due to the challenging terrain. The research team consisted of 3 individuals who introduced themselves only by first names. Dr. Sarah, a geologist, Marcus, who appeared to be some kind of federal agent, and Elena, whose role was never clearly explained. They carried specialized equipment I didn't recognize and maintained a level of secrecy about their mission that seemed unusual for typical park research activities. The helicopter flight took us deep into areas of the canyon I had only seen on topographical maps. We flew over side canyons, mesas, and rock formations that had no official names and no established trails leading to them. After about 40 minutes, we landed on a narrow plateau about 3,000 feet below the rim, surrounded by towering sandstone walls that created a natural amphitheater roughly the size of a city block. What I found on that plateau challenged every assumption I had developed about the Grand Canyon during my career. The area contained clear evidence of extensive human activity, not the temporary camps of hikers or researchers, but permanent installations that appeared to have been there for decades. There were several large buildings constructed from local stone designed to blend seamlessly with the natural rock formations. Solar panels and communication equipment were positioned to be invisible from above, and a network of trails had been carved into the canyon walls to provide access routes that would never be detected by casual observation. Dr. Sarah led us to the largest of the buildings, which turned out to be a sophisticated research facility containing equipment I had never seen before. Computer systems monitored seismic activity, atmospheric conditions, and what appeared to be electromagnetic fields throughout the canyon system. Wall-mounted displays showed detailed maps of the Grand Canyon with hundreds of red dots marking specific locations. These represent incidents over the past 50 years, Dr. Sarah explained. gesturing toward the displays. Missing persons, unexplained phenomena, equipment failures, and other anomalies that couldn't be explained through conventional means. Marcus opened a series of filing cabinets and showed me case files documenting incidents I remembered from my own experience, along with dozens of others that had never been reported to park rangers or included in official records. Each file contained detailed investigative reports, witness statements, and evidence that had been collected and analyzed by this hidden research operation. The most disturbing discovery was a database containing profiles of every park employee who had worked at the Grand Canyon for more than 10 years. My own file contained information about my personal life, career performance evaluations, and psychological assessments that I had never authorized or participated in. We monitor long-term employees, Elena explained when she saw my expression. The canyon affects some people differently than others. Those who work here for extended periods sometimes develop sensitivities to phenomena that most visitors never notice. She led me to another section of the facility, where dozens of audio and video recordings were stored. The recordings documented incidents that had occurred throughout the canyon over several decades. Strange lights in remote areas, unexplained sounds echoing from deep within the rock formations, and sightings of structures or activities that appeared and disappeared without explanation. Many of the recordings had been made by park rangers, including several that I recognized as colleagues who had worked at the Grand Canyon during my tenure. In one video from 2015, I watched a ranger I had known for years documenting the discovery of ancient petroglyphs in a location that was supposedly inaccessible to early human populations. The Grand Canyon is more than just a geological formation, Dr. Sarah told me as we reviewed the evidence. It's a place where the normal rules of physics and time seem to operate differently. The rock formations create unique electromagnetic fields. The depth and scale affect human perception in ways we don't fully understand. And the canyon has been attracting unexplained phenomena for as long as humans have been keeping records. She showed me research data indicating that the Grand Canyon experiences significantly higher rates of unexplained disappearances, equipment failures, and sensory anomalies than any other national park. The research team had been documenting and studying these phenomena for over 30 years, operating under a classification level that kept their work hidden from normal park service operations. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked, still struggling to process the implications of what I was learning. "Because you're retiring," Marcus responded. "Long-term employees who are leaving the park service are briefed on our activities as a safety measure. You've been working in an environment that most people don't understand, and you've probably experienced things over the years that you couldn't explain or report through normal channels." He was right. During my 20 years at the Grand Canyon, I had encountered dozens of incidents that didn't fit normal categories. Search and rescue missions where we found evidence of missing persons in impossible locations, equipment that malfunctioned in ways that defied troubleshooting, and areas of the canyon where experienced rangers reported feeling disoriented or experiencing time distortion. I had always attributed these experiences to the challenging nature of working in extreme wilderness conditions. But the research facility revealed that they were part of a larger pattern that had been systematically documented and studied for decades. The research team's final revelation was the most shocking. They showed me evidence that the Grand Canyon serves as some kind of natural laboratory, where unusual phenomena occur more frequently than anywhere else on Earth. The specific combination of geological features, electromagnetic fields, and scale creates conditions that seem to thin the boundaries between what we consider normal reality and something else entirely. The Park Service has been aware of this for over 50 years, Elena explained. That's why certain areas remain closed to the public, why some search and rescue missions are handled differently than others, and why long-term employees are monitored and eventually briefed when they leave. I spent my final day as a Grand Canyon Ranger, learning that the place where I had devoted my career was far stranger and more mysterious than I had ever imagined. The canyon I thought I knew was just the surface layer of something much deeper and more complex, something that continues to operate according to rules that we're only beginning to understand. Now, a year into my retirement, I still live near the Grand Canyon, but I see it with completely different eyes. Every sunrise over the rim, every tourist taking pictures at the overlooks, every search and rescue mission reported in the local news carries new meaning for me. I know that beneath the natural wonder that attracts millions of visitors lies a system of monitoring, research, and mystery that has been operating in secret for decades. If you've worked in our national parks for an extended period, especially in places like the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, or other locations known for unexplained phenomena, pay attention to the things that don't quite fit normal patterns. Document what you observe. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. And remember that some of the most important discoveries in these wilderness areas may never appear in official reports. The truth about our national parks runs much deeper than the tourist brochures suggest. And sometimes it takes a career's worth of experience to glimpse the real mysteries hidden beneath the surface of America's most treasured landscapes. If you found these stories as disturbing as I did while researching them, make sure to subscribe to Verified Fears for more true encounters that challenge everything we think we know about the wilderness around us. Hit that notification bell because the truth about our national parks is stranger than fiction. And these rangers' experiences prove that some places hold secrets we're only beginning to understand.